The early hours of the 6th of June, 1944, were shrouded in darkness, fog, and uncertainty. Across the English Channel, thousands of Allied soldiers waited in landing crafts, their hearts pounding with fear and hope. They were about to step onto the beaches of Normandy, a moment that would decide the fate of Europe. But before the tanks, paratroopers, and infantry ever reached the sand, another group of men had already gone in quietly, almost invisibly, beneath the waves. These were the D-Day divers. Men whose mission was so secret that few would ever know their names, and whose work would be crucial in either making the invasion possible or dooming it entirely. Imagine the scene. The English coast is alive with preparation. Ships are loaded, maps spread, generals argue over tides and wind. The beaches of Normandy seem calm from a distance, but the coastline is a deadly trap. The Germans had spent years fortifying it, laying mines, steel obstacles, and underwater barriers designed to shred boats and soldiers alike. If even a single channel was blocked, if a single mine went undetected, the invasion could fail before it began. And that's where these divers came in. Ordinary men, by most accounts, but extraordinary in courage, skill, and nerve. These were the engineers of the deep, the invisible force who swam through freezing water under cover of darkness, knowing that a single misstep could cost them their lives. Armed with nothing more than primitive diving gear, underwater hammers, and explosives, they became the unseen architects of one of history's greatest military operations. They scouted the beaches, mapped the underwater obstacles, and in many cases, blew them apart, all while evading German sentries and patrols. The story of these men begins long before that fateful morning. In the years leading up to D-Day, the Allies knew that a cross-channel invasion would be the turning point of the war. They pored over intelligence reports, aerial photographs, and captured documents. But the more they learned, the clearer it became. No army in history had faced anything like this. Normandy was a fortress, a choke point fortified with deadly ingenuity. Mines lined the waters, wooden stakes and steel beams protruded from the sand to pierce landing crafts, and hidden underwater obstacles threatened to destroy every attempt at a beach landing. Commanders needed someone who could go where soldiers could not. They needed men who could blend into the water and disappear into the night, who could dive beneath the surface and work in silence. The task was unprecedented. Unlike bombers or artillery, which could attack from a distance, these divers had to place themselves directly in the path of danger, relying on stealth and precision. The men selected for this mission were drawn from the Royal Navy, the Royal Engineers, and specialized units known for their courage and adaptability. Many had experience with underwater demolition, but nothing could fully prepare them for the scale of what lay ahead. They trained in secret, often in freezing rivers and hidden bays, learning to navigate in darkness, to handle explosives with exacting care, and to endure the mental strain of knowing a single mistake meant death. But even with training, there was no way to simulate the reality of Normandy's beaches. They would face cold water that sapped strength, currents that could carry them miles off course, and the constant threat of discovery by German sentries. Their lives would depend not only on skill but on nerves of steel. Every dive carried the possibility of instant death from an enemy bullet, a hidden mine, or the crushing weight of the sea itself. As D-Day approached, tension mounted. Intelligence reports suggested that some channels might be too heavily mined to clear in time. Some generals whispered that the divers' mission was nearly impossible. Yet the divers pressed on. They studied maps, conducted reconnaissance, and memorized every detail of the coastline. They became intimately familiar with the landscape of destruction they were about to enter, each man aware that the lives of thousands of soldiers depended on their success. On the night before the invasion, small groups of divers slipped from landing craft, moving silently through the dark, icy water. Their goal was simple but terrifying: locate the mines, chart the obstacles, and clear a path. But simple is deceptive. Every sound echoed across the water, every movement risked detection. They had to work quickly, yet carefully, for one wrong step could trigger an explosion. Many of these divers would go hours without surfacing, relying on primitive breathing equipment that limited their oxygen supply, their minds focused entirely on the task at hand. And while they worked, history itself hung in the balance. The Allied invasion force waited, counting on the divers to succeed. If the underwater obstacles were not removed, landing crafts would be shredded on impact, soldiers trapped and mowed down before they even touched the sand. The fate of the invasion, and perhaps the war, rested on these few, unseen men. Yet despite the danger, despite the uncertainty, these divers did not hesitate. They moved with discipline and courage, clearing channels under moonless skies, swimming past razor-sharp stakes, and sometimes encountering mines just inches away. Many were injured, some killed, but most would remain silent about their work for decades, their stories hidden in official records, forgotten in the roar of history. It's hard to overstate the significance of their contribution. When the first waves of soldiers hit the beaches of Normandy, the divers' labor was already behind them. Channels had been cleared, obstacles destroyed, and landing zones mapped. The soldiers themselves might never have seen the men who made it possible, but every foot gained on the beach, every life spared, was thanks to these quiet heroes. Even today, their work is almost legendary in its audacity. The conditions they endured were brutal, the danger constant, and the stakes unimaginable. For many, it was the most terrifying mission of their lives. For some, it was the last. But for all, it was a testament to courage, skill, and determination. These were the men who took the fight to the enemy before anyone else dared, men who literally went beneath the surface to ensure victory. And yet, not everything went according to plan. Some channels were more heavily mined than anticipated. Some divers were discovered, killed, or forced to abort their mission. Their failures, as much as their successes, shaped the course of the invasion. The line between triumph and disaster was razor-thin, and the world would only later understand the full scope of what these men faced. By the time the sun rose over the beaches of Normandy, a hidden war beneath the waves had already been fought. The D-Day divers had done their part, often alone and unseen, and the invasion could proceed. Their bravery and sacrifice laid the groundwork for one of the most critical moments in modern history. Without them, the beaches might have been a graveyard, a place where thousands more lives would have been lost before the first gun was fired. In the shadow of this story lies a haunting question. How many of these men were truly remembered? How many were celebrated? And how many slipped quietly back into obscurity, their deeds known only to those who lived through the invasion? It's a reminder that history is often shaped not just by the armies that march and the generals who command, but by those who move unseen, who take risks invisible to the wider world, and whose courage quietly shifts the balance of fate. As night fell over the English Channel, the D-Day divers readied themselves for a mission unlike any the world had ever seen. They slipped silently into the icy waters, their bodies numb from the cold, their minds sharp with focus. Every wave threatened to betray them, every shadow could hide an enemy patrol, every heartbeat was a reminder that one mistake would be fatal. These men were entering a world most soldiers would never see, a world beneath the surface, where danger was invisible, where courage was tested in silence. Their first challenge was the mines. The Germans had spent years perfecting them, embedding them in sand, anchoring them beneath the waves, designing them to detonate on contact or via tripwire. The divers could not rely on chance. They had to locate each one, determine if it was live, and neutralize it with meticulous care. Using basic tools and rudimentary explosives, they worked under the pressure of cold water that sapped strength and time that was running out. Imagine holding your breath for minutes at a time, your hands trembling from cold, your body strained. While a mine rests just feet away, any slip could end not only your life, but the entire mission. Some divers swam for miles along the coastline, mapping obstacles that would later guide landing craft. They marked stakes hidden beneath the surf, steel beams meant to pierce boats, and other traps laid out with terrifying precision. Many of these structures were almost invisible, camouflaged by sand or tides. One wrong move, and a diver could trigger an explosion, taking himself and possibly an entire landing team with him. Yet they pressed on. They became experts in reading the ocean, learning to interpret currents, tides, and the subtle signs of underwater hazards. There were moments of sheer terror. In some sectors, divers were confronted with mines floating loose, swinging unpredictably in the waves. Others discovered obstacles stacked like deadly jigsaw puzzles, each piece designed to destroy boats on impact. One account describes a diver who had to wedge himself between two massive steel beams to prevent them from collapsing while placing an explosive to clear the path. The water roared in his ears, cold burned his limbs, and above him the darkness hid countless dangers. He completed the task and surfaced minutes later, bloodied, exhausted, yet alive. But the divers were not only fighting the physical dangers of the water, they were also racing against time. The invasion fleet was scheduled to arrive in mere hours, and any delay could doom the entire operation. Some channels had to be cleared at night, others at low tide. The work was exhausting, repetitive, and unrelentingly dangerous. Yet, in that silence, these men moved with precision, a combination of careful planning, brute endurance, and raw courage that few could comprehend. Perhaps the most astonishing aspect of their mission was the sheer scale. Hundreds of mines, thousands of obstacles, and miles of coastline needed to be surveyed and cleared, and they did it with primitive technology. Diving suits were heavy, air tanks limited, and underwater communication nearly impossible. Many worked alone, others in pairs, relying on signals and intuition to coordinate. The water was dark and frigid, the enemy near, and yet they continued, driven by a sense of duty, discipline, and the knowledge that lives depended on them. Even when discovered, the divers rarely had a chance to fight back. Unlike soldiers on land, they had no cover, no reinforcements waiting. Some were spotted by German patrols and forced to flee underwater, their hearts racing, lungs burning, praying the enemy did not see them. Others were attacked by unexpected hazards, snapping tides, strong currents, or sharp metal that tore their suits. Still, they adapted. Many learned to use the environment itself as camouflage, hiding beneath kelp, sand, or debris, waiting for patrols to pass, then continuing their work once danger subsided. Despite the chaos, there were moments of ingenuity and heroism. One diver reportedly found a German explosive trap designed to detonate if disturbed. With steady hands and nerves of steel, he carefully disarmed it, saving not only himself but the men who would later land in that zone. Another team encountered a maze of stakes arranged in a brutal pattern, each one capable of piercing the hull of a landing craft. They devised a method to attach small charges to the stakes, blowing a corridor just wide enough for boats to pass. Every success was a quiet triumph, invisible to the millions who would later celebrate the landings. Their work was relentless. They would dive, surface briefly to signal each other, then return beneath the waves, often for hours on end. Their muscles cramped, their lungs burned, but the knowledge that failure meant disaster kept them going. And yet, not all missions succeeded. Some divers were lost to mines, some swept away by currents, others discovered by German forces. The line between victory and tragedy was razor-thin, and each dive carried the weight of the entire invasion on its shoulders. These men were also the first to witness the fortified horrors of Normandy. From beneath the water, they saw the scale of the German defences, rows of mines, steel beams, underwater obstacles, and barricades so carefully placed that it was impossible not to feel a chill at the thought of what would happen if they failed. For hours, they moved like ghosts, mapping, clearing, disarming, and documenting. Their work was painstaking, methodical, and performed under conditions that would break the mind and body of most ordinary men. But there was more than danger in the water. There was also the human cost. Many divers struggled with fear, exhaustion, and the mental toll of seeing friends lost to invisible threats. Some were haunted for decades by the memory of missions where survival was a matter of inches, where every decision could mean life or death. Yet, even in the face of such pressure, the divers' focus never wavered. They understood the stakes, and they understood that the lives of thousands of soldiers depended on their success. Interestingly, the divers also had to innovate on the fly. Plans rarely survived first contact with the reality of the coastline. Currents were stronger than expected, obstacles more complex, mines more sensitive. Many relied on gut instinct and quick thinking, adapting their techniques to meet each new challenge. In some cases, they had to improvise explosives, fashion tools from available materials, and make split-second decisions that would determine the fate of the entire operation. Their combination of skill, courage, and ingenuity is what made the mission possible. By the early hours of June 6, most of the assigned sectors had been cleared, or at least made passable. Channels were marked with buoys or other discrete signals. Obstacles were destroyed or documented so that landing craft could navigate safely. The divers' work had transformed a deadly coastline into a navigable path. The soldiers approaching in landing crafts had no idea that beneath the waves, men had risked everything so they could step onto the beach. For many, the divers' efforts were invisible, their sacrifices uncelebrated, yet they had literally paved the way for history. And yet, despite all this heroism, the mission was far from flawless. Some channels were only partially cleared, some mines went undetected, and in those sectors, soldiers would later face chaos and carnage. But even in failure, the divers' work had bought crucial time, reduced casualties, and given commanders a fighting chance. Without their courage and skill, the invasion might have been a catastrophic failure. The story of the D-Day divers is also a story of quiet bravery, of men who did not seek glory, who risked everything without expectation of recognition. Many returned to ordinary lives after the war, their extraordinary contributions known only to a few. Some were decorated, but most faded into the background of history, their deeds whispered in naval records or shared in private among comrades. Yet, without them, the beaches of Normandy could have been a graveyard instead of a turning point in the war. As dawn approached on June 6, the first waves of soldiers began to approach the shore. The water, once a barrier of mines and obstacles, had been tamed by the divers. The coast that had seemed impenetrable was now a path, narrow but sufficient for the landing force. Soldiers would fight on the sand, tanks would roll in, and history would be made. But underneath it all, the divers' mission remained largely unknown. Their work had been done in silence, beneath the waves, in the dark, in freezing water, and yet it had been vital to the success of the operation. The divers had not just cleared obstacles, they had cleared the way for victory. They had faced death in silence and with precision. They had stared into the abyss and returned to tell the tale. And yet, for all their skill and courage, some would never come back. Their sacrifice was hidden beneath the waves, their heroism unmarked by monuments or headlines. The truth is, D-Day could have been lost at sea before it ever reached the shore. The divers were the invisible shield, the silent architects, the men who turned a plan that could have failed into one of history's most audacious victories. Their story is a reminder that behind every great battle, behind every celebrated victory, there are unseen heroes whose courage is no less remarkable. The first light of dawn broke over the Normandy coastline, painting the sky with pale pinks and greys, as if the world itself held its breath. Below the surface, the D-Day divers had already completed their mission. Channels were cleared, obstacles destroyed, and pathways mapped for the landing craft that now approached. Every second was tense. Every wave carried the weight of thousands of lives. Above the water, the invasion began, but beneath it, the silent legacy of the divers unfolded a story of courage that would remain largely invisible to history. The landing crafts surged forward, engines roaring, soldiers gripping rifles and equipment with trembling hands. The beaches that had seemed insurmountable a few hours before were now navigable, a testament to the divers' painstaking work. Yet danger was far from over. In some sectors, mines had gone undetected, stakes had survived, and German defences were ready to strike. The chaos on the beaches that followed would be catastrophic, but the divers' success had already bought critical time. Many lives would be spared because someone had gone beneath the waves in the dark of night, armed with nothing but courage and explosives. The men of the first waves hit the sand and were met with a storm of fire and steel. Bullets ricocheted, mortars exploded, and soldiers scrambled for cover. Yet, thanks to the channels the divers had cleared, tanks could land, artillery could move inland, and the soldiers could begin to push back the German defences. In places where the divers' work had been flawless, entire units survived with minimal casualties, their path made possible by men they would never see. Meanwhile, stories of heroism continued under the surface. Some divers had stayed in the water, patrolling the approaches, ensuring that later waves could land safely. They moved like shadows, correcting last-minute mistakes, clearing debris that had shifted in the tide, and guiding soldiers with subtle signals. Their presence, invisible to most, was essential. Every second they spent in the water reduced the risk of disaster, and every obstacle they removed saved lives. The human cost of their work, however, was undeniable. Several divers never made it back. Some were caught by German patrols, others swept away by tides, and a few were lost to the unforgiving sea. Their names would not be spoken in speeches, their images would not adorn history books, but their sacrifice was written into the very success of D-Day. Without them, entire beaches could have become tombs, landing craft shredded before soldiers even set foot on land. Amidst the chaos, there were moments of almost cinematic bravery. One diver reportedly swam back to an unexploded mine after a landing craft had passed, detonating it safely to prevent the next wave from disaster. Another climbed atop a half-submerged steel obstacle, placing explosives while bullets whizzed by, knowing that if he failed, hundreds of men would be trapped in the surf. These moments were silent and fleeting, yet monumental in impact. They were acts performed not for glory, but for duty, for comrades, and for the larger mission that hung in the balance. By mid-morning, the tide of battle began to shift. Allied forces gained a foothold on the beaches, pushing inland against German defences. Soldiers could advance more quickly because the divers' work had removed the most immediate threats. Tanks could maneuver, medics could reach the wounded, and supplies could be brought ashore. The invisible path forged beneath the waves had become the backbone of the invasion. The divers' labour, often unseen and unrecognised, was now embedded in every successful advance on the beach. And yet, the story is not just one of triumph. In some areas, obstacles remained, casualties mounted, and the true peril of Normandy's coast was laid bare. It was a stark reminder of how razor-thin the margin for success had been. The divers' mission had been critical, but it was not infallible. History hung on their precision, their courage, and their ability to adapt in real time. In the moments when everything could have gone wrong, it did not. The invasion had been made possible, in no small part, by men who moved in silence, beneath the waves, risking everything for a chance at victory. As the hours passed and the Allies secured more ground, the scale of the divers' contribution began to emerge, though still largely invisible. Without their work, landing crafts would have been lost to hidden obstacles, soldiers mowed down before reaching the shore, and the invasion might have faltered. Their mission had been a success, but it was a quiet, almost ghostly success. Unlike generals or soldiers whose bravery was visible on the battlefield, the divers' courage was measured in invisible victories and lives saved, written in actions rather than headlines. In the days and weeks that followed, the Allies continued to push inland, eventually liberating France and turning the tide of the war in Europe. But the story of the divers remained largely hidden, tucked away in classified reports, naval logs, and the quiet recollections of those who survived. Their role was vital, yet almost no one knew. It is a story that reminds us that history is not only shaped by the visible acts of war, the battles, the speeches, the medals, but also by unseen courage, by men and women who operate in shadows, whose sacrifices make victory possible. Some of the divers went on to ordinary lives after the war. They married, worked, and raised families. Few spoke of what they had endured. Many carried the memories with them, silent and private, a burden of both pride and grief. They were heroes without recognition, men whose names did not appear on monuments, but whose bravery was as real and as consequential as anyone who fought on the beaches above them. And so, the D-Day divers remain a testament to the hidden threads of history, the quiet architects of one of humanity's defining moments. Their story is a reminder that courage is not always loud, that heroism does not always seek attention, and that the fate of the world can rest on the shoulders of those who move unseen. Without them, D-Day could have been a catastrophe, an invasion remembered for loss instead of victory. With them, it became a turning point, a moment where courage beneath the waves shaped the course of history above them. In the end, the diver's story is one of human endurance, ingenuity, and sacrifice. It is a story of ordinary men performing extraordinary acts in silence, of lives risked and sometimes lost to ensure the survival of thousands more. It is the story of how the unseen can change everything, how the quiet work beneath the surface can ripple through history. And perhaps most importantly, it is the story of courage that does not wait for recognition, but acts anyway because the stakes are too high, and the mission must be completed, no matter the cost. As the sun rose fully over Normandy, casting light on the blood-soaked sand and battered defences. The work of the D-Day divers was done. The invasion had begun, history was being written, and the unseen heroes beneath the waves had completed their mission. They had made the impossible possible, and in doing so, they had changed the world forever.